If you have your Bibles, open up to Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8. We're still going through our encounters with Christ. We're actually going to be looking at what happens through the entire chapter of 8. The main thing we're going to look at is verse 22 down through verse 30. But I want to set up what's going on here. You need to keep what's going on in context. There is a healing that we looked at a couple of weeks ago where Jesus heals this deaf man. And if you remember that, he spit on his fingers, he touched his ears, and healed this guy. Jesus has performed a miracle before that where he fed 5,000 men and women and children, probably 15,000, 20,000 people. And that was in Jewish territory. And right before this event we're looking at this morning at the first part of chapter 8, you're going to see a parallel here with what happens in chapter 6, except this time Jesus is in Gentile territory. During Jesus' ministry in the Decapolis, that's that 10-city region, is to the east of the Jordan rivers, to the east of the Sea of Galilee. And we're not going to read that whole thing, but it's pretty much the same thing that happened when he fed the 5,000. There are these people sitting there for 3 days listening to Jesus teach, and they had nothing to eat. And Jesus performs this miracle. Almost identical. The numbers are a little bit different, but it's almost identical to what happened when he fed those 5,000. And in verse 11, the Pharisees show up. They travel into Gentile territory, which is kind of unusual, but that's how much they don't like Jesus. They hear Jesus is now over here stirring up trouble and causing problems. So the Pharisees shows up and start to argue with him. And they said, give us a sign to prove to you that you are the Messiah. And there in verse 12 it says he sighs deeply. He's just frustrated. He's catching his breath. He's taking his time. He's being patient with them, even though they really don't deserve it. And he's like, why does this generation keep demanding a sign? He's like, I'm not going to give any sign to this generation. You've seen all you're going to see. And he and his disciples get back in the boat and they go back to the other side. And in verse 14, they're getting hungry, the disciples, and they're like, we don't have anything to eat. They forgot to bring some of the bread, and if you go back and look, there was a lot of food left over. There were 7 baskets of leftover pieces. We don't really know what happened to it, but the disciples apparently forgot to bring some. So they're sitting in the boat, and Jesus is there. And they've just witnessed another miracle. They've dealt with the Pharisees once again, and Jesus has put them in their place saying, I'm through with you guys. I'm not going to play these games with you. And the disciples are sitting there. And they've only got this one loaf of bread. And you ever been in a group of people and you don't have enough food? I can remember hanging out with my buddies, and it was just like a little bit of food. I'm looking around trying to figure out who's going to get left out because I'm going to get mine. And they're sitting around, and Jesus knows what they're thinking. He knows what's going on. And notice in verse 15 it says he gives them very strict orders. He's like, watch out, beware of the leaven or the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast or the leaven of Herod. And they've been talking about the fact that they didn't have enough bread, and they misunderstand what Jesus is saying. Even though he just dealt with the Pharisees, they have just had this encounter, and now they're talking amongst themselves. What is he talking about? The yeast of the Pharisees, the yeast of Herod? And Jesus knows what's going on. Even if they're not speaking out loud, he understands the conversation. And he says in verse 17, why are you talking about the fact that you have no bread? Don't you understand? Don't you comprehend? Do you have hardened hearts? This is an issue that the 12 had to deal with constantly throughout their 3 years with Jesus. You would think that the guys walking around with him day and night, seeing all these things, would get it, but they're human. They're trying to figure out, is this Messiah the Messiah we are expecting? Is it something different? We know Jesus is different. They packed up and left and followed him, so they believe something about him, but they're just not getting it. And look what he says in verse 18. And think, Jesus has just healed a deaf man. That hasn't been too terribly long ago. They witnessed this. He said, do you have eyes and not see? Do you have ears and not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of leftover did you collect? That was that first encounter. 12, they told him. And then I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000. How many were left over? He said 7. And he said to them, don't you understand yet? They're still not grasping it. We're looking at individuals having these encounters with Jesus, but remember, at every one of these encounters, the disciples are there seeing the same things. They're getting to spend time with Jesus that the others don't. They're getting more in-depth teaching. They're getting one-on-one face time with Jesus, and even they are not understanding these encounters and what they truly mean. Verse 22, which is the main part we're looking at, says, then they came to Bethsaida. They brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and brought him out of the village. Spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking. Again, Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes. The man looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him home, saying, don't even go to the village. This is the only miracle recorded in Scripture where it's not completely instantaneous, where it seems to be 2 stages to the miracle. Some have suggested that Jesus didn't completely heal the guy the first time, and it required another miracle, but I don't believe that's the case here. I believe Jesus is doing this in stages, first of all, to teach the man a lesson, but second of all, to teach these 12 guys that have been with him everywhere a lesson. He has just asked them, can you not see what I'm doing? He's just asked them, can you not hear? And it's interesting, a lot of Jesus' miracles, and we talked about this before, were public. They were very public. Everybody could see what was going on. I think about the woman who made her way through the crowd and reached out and touched the edge of his garment. Everybody saw that. But if you remember the very next one where he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, that was a private thing. This is a private thing. Jesus takes this man away from everyone else. He leads him outside the village. We can speculate, but I believe it's so he can have this one-on-one interaction. Jesus is not getting distracted by anything, but it's very easy for others to be distracted. Oftentimes his disciples were distracted. But he takes this man one-on-one, and he wants this man to understand what's happening. He wants to avoid the publicity. Everywhere Jesus goes, these crowds show up, physically hindering some of the things that he can move around and do. The 3 exceptions to the public miracles we just mentioned. The deaf man, if you remember, he takes that man to the side. He takes Jairus and his wife upstairs to where their daughter is lying. And now you have this individual. Personal, intimate, one-on-one encounter with Christ. We talked about the spit when he healed the deaf man and the superstitions that came along with that. And he's going to do that again here. And like I said, it's still gross. I know we talked about it with the deaf guy, but it's still kind of gross when you think about it. But that was the prevailing superstition of the day. That would be something that wouldn't take people by surprise. And Jesus is using something that they can understand and something that they can relate to. And like I said, at first it looks like, and people have suggested that somehow Jesus didn't completely heal the guy. Like Jesus somehow failed. Notice, he spits on he probably didn't spit in his eyes. Let's just get that out of the way. He probably spit on his fingers just like he did with the blind man and rubbed it on his eyes. And he says, can you see? Now the man's response, he says, I see people and they look like trees walking around, which says he has vision, but it's blurred. He can't quite make out what's going on. That seems to suggest that this man probably wasn't born blind. The fact that he can recognize that there's people walking around, if he's never seen that before, how would he know what he's looking at? So this man probably was not born blind. He probably lost his sight at some point. Some have suggested that along with the superstitious nature of the people, with the spit and the touch, some have suggested that perhaps this man's eyes were scaled over or had scabs. And the spit, as gross as it may sound, actually had a practical application. It loosened these scabs. It loosened whatever it may have been binding this man's eyes together. But the man could see. He was blind. Now he can see, but he can't see completely. So did Jesus fail? No. Did the man lack faith? Doesn't appear so. Once again, I believe Jesus is using this as a lesson for this man, but also a lesson for the 12. Imagine all the things they've seen, and yet they're still having a difficult time grasping. Jesus says, you think you're seeing what's going on, but you really can't see. Much like this man, after Jesus touches his eyes, he can see, but he can't fully understand. He can't fully comprehend the things that are in front of him. He's not blind. He could probably get around for the rest of his life like this, but he wouldn't be able to see the details. He wouldn't have clear vision. And my imagination kicks in. Jesus has taken the man away from the crowds. I imagine the disciples are still there. Can you imagine what they're thinking? Can you imagine what the man is thinking? The truth is we just don't know. My mind's going, perhaps this man is thinking, well, I can see better than I could, but that didn't help a whole lot. Perhaps the disciples are looking at each other going, did Jesus just fail? Did he just mess up? And in my mind's eye, this is pure imagination, I can imagine Jesus looking around at the 12 and looking back at the man. And remember, Jesus is filled with compassion in these situations. He has compassion for this man. And Jesus touches the man again, tenderly, lovingly, compassionately. And he puts his hands on the man's eyes. And notice what it says, the man looked intently. And his sight was completely restored. He can see everything. He can see the details. He sees everything what is clearly. No cloud, no confusion, no blurriness. He's completely healed. And then Jesus tells him, much like he's told others, go home. Don't even go back to the village. It's interesting because the village here is Bethsaida. Bethsaida is one of the places where Jesus went and the people lacked faith. He wasn't able to perform a lot of miracles there at his hometown or here because of their lack of faith. He pronounces judgment on Bethsaida because they have seen the works of God and just don't believe. Jesus says, don't go back there. Just go home. Don't tell anyone. And this man, unlike a lot of the people, apparently does what Jesus says. He goes home. I can only imagine the conversations he has when he gets home. His family there, his friends there. But he's had this encounter. And he has been healed. He has seen the Messiah. And now I want to look at the second part of this encounter, because I believe this encounter was just as much for the 12 as it was for this blind man. Jesus went out with his disciples after this in verse 27 to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the road he asked the disciples, who do you say I am? Seems like a perfectly acceptable question. He's constantly having to rebuke them. He's like, can't you see the things that are going on? Can't you hear what I'm saying? Are your hearts hard? So who do you really think I am? You've been following me. You've left everything and I commend you. You've shown faith. But who do you really think that I am? And they answer him. They give him all the answers that they've heard. Some say John the Baptist, reincarnated. That's what King Herod thought. Herod thought that John had come back to life to get him because he had killed him. It's like some say you're John the Baptist. Others say Elijah. And the reason Elijah, there was an anticipation that before Messiah came, Elijah would return. Remember, Elijah didn't die. God carted him off to heaven in a chariot of fire. And the expectation was Elijah's coming back, and some say you're the Elijah. Others said you're one of the prophets. And in the parallel encounters, they actually say, some say you are the prophet that Moses spoke of. And once again, I can only imagine what Jesus is thinking. He's hearing these answers. The same answers he's been hearing from others. They're not surprising him. He knows what they think. He knows what they believe. He's not asking this question because he lacks the knowledge. He's asking this question because he wants them to understand. After everything that they have seen, they've just seen a blind man, eyes opened. There's actually going to be another healing that we're going to look at as we finish up this encounter. Right before the triumphal entry, blind Bartimaeus is going to have an encounter with Jesus. And that kind of bookends this entire section of the Gospel of Mark. So Jesus is sitting there. Perhaps he lets them think about the question, even after they've answered, and he's walking along, nodding. Mm-hmm. And in my mind's eye, once again, divine imagination. I can imagine him stopping and turning around and looking. Well, that's good. John, Elijah, the prophets. But who do you say that I am? And he makes it personal. And Peter says, you are the Messiah. This is the short version. The longer version says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because God revealed this to you. And look what he says. He strictly warned them to tell no one about him. Now, I can understand the people that have been healed, the people who have had their daughter raised from the dead. I can understand those had demons cast out. I can understand Jesus telling those individuals, don't tell anybody. But this is the 12. These are the ones Jesus handpicked to go into the world and make disciples, but yet Jesus says, don't tell anyone right now. And then it says he began to teach them more. He wants them to put on the brakes just a minute. They've already displayed the fact that they're not grasping everything. They're not quite seeing who Jesus is. They're not quite hearing the things that he is saying. Much like the man that has just been healed, they can see, but they can't see clearly. They don't have a good vision. They're still not understanding exactly who it is they are with. And Peter makes a good first step. You're the Messiah. And Jesus says, that's good. Then he says, I need to teach you some more. And it says from that moment on, he begins to teach them that he, the Son of Man, and that's a title Jesus used for himself more than any other. The Son of Man is going to have to suffer many things. He's going to be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. And they've already seen that. They already know the Pharisees can't stand him. And he's like, and he's going to be killed. Jesus has just affirmed Peter's statement that he is the Messiah, and now he's telling them, I am the Messiah, but I'm going to die. And that flies in the face of their expectations. He's like, but Jesus continually told people that he was going to die, but he always said, and then I will rise again in 3 days. And it says he spoke openly about this. And as this encounter comes to a close, because we're getting ready to have the transfiguration coming up, Peter, I can relate to Peter. Peter's one of those guys that has those mountaintop moments and he says the exact right thing at the exact right time, and God says, you're blessed. And then he turns right around and puts his foot in his mouth and says something stupid. I can relate. Peter just answered the question correctly, showing that he can see somewhat. But he hears Jesus say, I am the Messiah. I'm the Son of Man, but I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to be killed. And even though he says that I'm going to be raised from the dead 3 days, Peter takes Jesus aside. And what does it say? He begins to rebuke him. Peter may be able to see, but it's not clear. He's still clouded. He's clouded by his own expectations of what Messiah is. He may be clouded by his own personal ambitions. He's like, Jesus, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to let that happen. But turning around, and I think this is interesting because this conversation seems to take place just between Peter and Jesus. Peter takes Jesus aside, much like Jesus takes these people aside and has these encounters. Peter doesn't want the other guys to hear what he's about to say. He takes Jesus aside and says, hey, that's not right. That's not going to happen. But Jesus turns around and looks at the other guys and involves them. And then he rebukes Peter. Says, get behind me, what? Satan. That means adversary. That means enemy. You are not thinking about God's concerns, but human concerns. Even the 12. Even after experiencing every one of these encounters, remember, every one of these encounters, those guys are right there. They're seeing these things happen. They are hearing Jesus teach. Even when they get the right answer, they are still not seeing clearly. But that's going to change, because the next thing we see is they go up on the, Peter, James, and John go up on the mountain. And much like the second time, when Jesus touches the man's eyes, it says he looks intently and he sees clearly. What Peter, James, and John see when they go up on the Mount of Transfiguration, their eyes are wide open. They completely see. They're still going to mess some things up, and they're still going to get it wrong because they're human. I close every one of these sermons that we've been having with the same thing. I'm going to say the same thing that I typically say. Every single one of us need to have an encounter with Jesus Christ. Now, Scripture says that we confess him publicly. That's a public thing. We go before men and confess that he is Lord, and it says that Jesus will claim us before the Father. But that encounter, whatever it is you may be going through, whatever it is you may be struggling with, whatever it is that you're having to deal with, Jesus wants to meet with you one-on-one, personal, because that's how much he loves you. That's how much he cares for you. I appreciated Kevin's meditation this morning. Much like the wall in Vietnam with all those names written on it, all those ones that sacrificed. When you look at the cross and you come to the foot of the cross to encounter Christ, your name is written there not because you're the one that died there, because you're the one that put him there. But he still loves you. He still has the utmost compassion for you. He understands what you're going through. If you're hurting, he is hurting with you. And this morning, he's calling out to you. This morning, if you need to have your personal encounter with Jesus, he's right here. He's waiting, and he's willing.